The sermon title is The Blessedness of Brokenness. And I just want to say this is, I think, the high point in the life of Jacob and what God has put Jacob in here to teach us through his life. Okay? The blessedness of brokenness. And when I was young, I still remember hearing my first sermons about brokenness. And it had something to do with the idea that, God can only really use us when we are broken. And I remember the illustration. One of the illustrations was Gideon, when he was going to attack the enemy, and he had his torches, and they were hidden inside of these pottery vases. And so at the critical moment, they broke those vases, and the light came out, and they totally were able to surprise the enemy and rout the enemy. And the other popular illustration is a woman who came with perfume to anoint Jesus. And the thing is, until you broke the bottle, because in those days they didn't have screw caps, they didn't have corks, they didn't have any of that stuff, and this was very precious, they would have to break it. And so without the breaking, there could not be the benefit and the usefulness. And so they talked about that in those illustrative ways. We're going to get a little more specific, and for some of you who know the Bible pretty well, we're going to just kind of broaden it so you can understand it. But I want to start with something from a comic strip that used to run in all the newspapers. The comic strip was called Pogo, and it was set in the Okefenokee, believe it or not, that's a true word. It's an Indian word. Okefenokee swamps of Florida. And so the cartoonist was doing social satire. And so he would have these swamp animals discovering things and making comments, and he used it to make comments about the times. And this is at the time of the first wave of ecology, when they were trying to figure out, how to protect the planet and not ruin it. So he did this, and this became probably his most famous cartoon. So let me describe what you're seeing. So you got Pogo. He's the possum in the front with his friend the owl, and they're walking through the swamps, the forests, around the swamps. Oops, don't go yet. And this is the first line. Owl. Pogo, the beauty of the forest primeval gets me in the heart. And Pogo says, it gets me in the feet, porcupine. Oh, that's a porcupine, not an owl. Okay. Anyway, go to the next slide. Then they come to a place where everybody has littered the swamps and the forest, right? All the debris, all the junk. And they're sitting there looking at it, and all the joy is now gone. And Porcupine says, it is hard walking on this stuff. And Pogo says, yep, son, we have met the enemy, and he is us. You get that? We have met the enemy, and he is us. And what he's trying to say is, sometimes we are our own worst enemy. Okay? Because of difficulties and problems in our lives, we cause pain, sorrow, all kinds of bad things to fall on ourselves. So the problem in this cartoon was, what was the problem that was going on that caused all that litter? People are just basically lazy. Right? Now, I'm eating all these Luden's cough drops for my throat. And when I finish with a piece of paper, can you imagine if I walked around this church and they just threw it on the floor? You'd have these little white pieces of paper all over the place. Well, my mother taught me to put it either in my pocket or into something where I can throw it away. So I put them all in my pocket or my bag. All right? So yesterday I had a shirt, and I discovered that in the washing, that thing had blended into my pocket. But that's just not being lazy. But laziness can lead to all kinds of stuff. Let me show you some of the symptoms of laziness. Sometimes you're always cutting corners. Okay, you can get into trouble. Or you take the easy way out because you're lazy. Or you quit early or as soon as possible. You speed through things. You give up easily. You won't follow through. You want others to do things for you. You desire to be taken care of. These could all be symptoms of an underlying issue of simple laziness. Okay? And in the cartoon, this laziness results in, the ruining of the swamps and the forests and takes away the beauty and the joy of their habitation. Anyway, and so what we're talking about when we say we have met the enemy and he is us, that we are sometimes our own worst enemies, we have behaviors that sabotage our lives. Okay? We've called them by a whole bunch of names over the years. We've called them, currently we use the word dysfunction. We have used the word disorder. We've used the word, when I was going to college, hang-ups. Remember that old word, hang-ups? Problems, issues. These are things that we have, and we have trouble shaking them. Okay? And therefore, since we can't shake them, they have the capacity to cripple or even destroy our lives. And so we've said, Jacob had a problem of fear. It described more often than any other idea about him in these chapters that we've been reading about. It talked about Jacob's fearfulness. And this was something he had from the very beginning. Before he even knew, he felt the need to strive, to get out first, to be ahead of his brother. And so out of his fear comes rivalry, scheming, grabbing, greed, lying, dishonoring his parents. All of these things just kind of flowed from this. And so he's kind of like a polluted well. And so some of these things come by nature. Like I said, before he was born, before he was impacted. But then it was also aggravated by how he was raised, by how he was nurtured, right? The big debate, what is the source of our problems? Is it nature? Is it just always a part of us? Or is it something about how our environment impacts us? And in Jacob, we have a perfect example. He started off with certain problems that was a part of his character. But then, guess what? In his family, who did his father favor? Esau. Who did his mother favor? Him. Okay? And so you get that kind of thing. And, I grew up all by myself. So I didn't understand that problem too much. But I'd seen in other families how sibling rivalry became a big problem. And I've always heard the stories about siblings who sleep in the same bedroom who have a tape line down the middle of the closet, and each side would be decorated different, and, don't you dare come to my side, okay? And my question is, well, how do you get out the door? Anyway, and while I was on this trip, I finished a couple of good books. One of the books I finished that I'm highly recommending to everybody is a book called Becoming Grandma, okay? Yeah, and I'm reading it because, hey, it's about becoming a grandparent, and there's 2 chapters about grandfathers. And the 21st century grandparent is in a whole different world than the 20th century grandparent. Okay, but in the end of the chapter, when the author talks about the birth and the growth of the second daughter, or second granddaughter, she talks about how they will vie, how they will compete. And let me just read a little to you. She says, it's not easy having a younger sibling. I can only empathize with Jordan the older. How formative is, quote, you love her more. Now, people will say, when I was growing up, I always felt like Mom loved you more, Dad loved you more. And she's saying how important it is in impacting us. She says, the author, I suspect it's at the heart of us, one of the unappreciated forces in character development. We have profound effects on our brothers and sisters, and they on us. After all, we spend more time with one another growing up than with our parents, especially when they both work. We shape each other as we compete for love, attention, and approval. As Erica E. Good put it, quote, sibling relationships, and 80% of Americans have at least one, outlast marriages, survive the death of parents, resurface after quarrels that would sink any relationship. And so you can imagine Jacob and Esau growing up in that environment where, on the one hand, just in his character innately, he was fearful and he was expressing in these ways. But at the same time, he was stuck in a dynamic where one parent each favored a different child. Okay? And so a lot of problem would result. And so none of us escape this sort of thing because it's part of sin's impact on the world. And we all start off with the sin nature. And sometimes even our good things, when we use them too much or when we use them inappropriately because the world is impacted by sin, it can affect us. One of my good, bad points is I'm idealistic. Okay? I'm not a perfectionist. Okay? I'm idealistic. And so I can always see room for improvement. I want to make it better and better and better. And so as I do, the negative side, the problem that comes with it is I don't know when to stop improving it. Okay? And I don't know when to move on to the next thing I'm supposed to do. Henry Ford kind of had this problem. Henry Ford was building his Model T. And he kept coming up with new ideas to make it better. And finally, one friend said to him, Henry, you're never going to get this car built. All of your new ideas, why don't you save it for the next model? And Henry Ford says, that's a great idea. And so he finally got the Model T built, and then he put all his new ideas in the improvements. Now we call them version 1.2 or something like that. And so, anyway, it makes me not move on to doing other things. So even our good points can become problems. Let me talk about some of the other kind of issues that we often have. Some people have a problem, lack of self-discipline, right? And that's a shortcoming, so that we always need an outside push or pull, or we need to be carried. I mentioned that one because from what I read in parenting, we're raising a generation of kids who have a lack of self-discipline. And so we got to chase after them to deliver their homework, deliver their lunch, and nowadays parents are talking to the bosses to ask for the raise. And we have become too involved in helping them to succeed, and they don't have the self-discipline. But, we can express this lack of self-discipline by our unwillingness to plan, to think through details, to plan ahead. Related to this, some people have a problem, procrastination. You're never prepared. You're always putting it off, and you don't get it done. Others, inability to relate to people. You're overly critical. You're always comparing. For some people, it's turned inward. We rationalize. We justify our behaviors. We excuse ourselves, and we won't take responsibility. Others that you hear about today, problem of commitment. Making commitment, keeping commitment. We say yes, but it doesn't last. We look for excuses to quit. The Bible says, let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. Let your word be something people can rely on. Anger, hostility. The Bible condemns this as a sin quite often. And this comes out as hostility, distrust, belief that others are out to get you, trying to take advantage of you, looking down on you. And again, coming back to Jacob's problem, fear. Fear of failure, fear of success, fear of the unknown, fear of the new, fear of what's different. And we're just trying to avoid difficulty. And the great thing about Christianity is this. God accepts us as we are, right? But that's not the completion of grace. Grace is sabotaged. Grace is short-circuited if God just leaves us as we are. The full work of grace is after He has accepted us as we are, He would take us to a higher place, to becoming better people. Christianity isn't just about getting us back to zero, but about getting us into the plus column. And so that's why the Bible urges us to add to our development and our growth. And sometimes God will use very strong medicine to develop us and to add to it. Anyway, I want you to turn to Romans chapter 5 real quick. And I've always been impressed with this passage. And it starts off in the most unlikely way. Okay? Romans 5 verse 3. It says, we rejoice in our sufferings. Okay? And after talking about when we get suffering that we should be happy, it talks about the things that it can produce. It produces endurance. This endurance produces character. And this character produces hope. And this hope does not put us to shame because God's love is ours. And so it says, sometimes God will allow the struggles, the difficulties, the problems, the hurts and the pains in our lives, because He's more interested in us and our development than in providing us with a perfect environment to have an easy life. And so that's what God has been doing this whole time with Jacob, so that when Jacob comes to the end of his life, he doesn't have to say, I have met the enemy and it's me. But for a lot of this life, he has been his own worst enemy. He has the one that has been hurting himself. God is preparing Jacob to be one of the patriarchs. And He has determined that from the very beginning. So God is going to follow through with His commitment to this man, and He's going to take him to the big boys' school, which is where we've been in chapter 32, and He's going to do His most important work. So that by the time we come to chapter 33, at the age of, guess what? 97, we see Jacob finally with a breakthrough from his dysfunction, from his issue, from his underlying root problem that has been sabotaging his life. And I so appreciate that this happens when he's 97, because I look at my life, and I still shake my head. And I says, why am I still like this? Why do I fail in that? Why am I not quit in those ways? Well, I'm not 97 yet. I got a few more years to grow and to develop. And, it's a great thing that we can continue to develop. So I want us now to get back into Jacob, and we're going to go to Genesis chapter 33. And we're going to look at verse 3, because this is the verse where he has his long-dreaded encounter. And I know a little bit of how this feels. Not quite. I still remember the first time I was going to meet my so-called brother, my perfect brother. Boy, I didn't know how to react, how to respond. And then I still remember the first time I was going to meet my adult sister, and I didn't know how to respond. Well, Jacob is now going to see Esau. And the last he heard, Esau had sworn to kill him. And the mom says, when he calms down, we'll send word and we'll bring you home. No word ever came from mom. And he knows that Esau is coming with 400 men. So in his mind, he thinks Esau is going to crush him like a bug. Okay? And so here's how, at the final moment, how he responds. It says, he himself went on before them. Who's the them? The rest of his entourage. Now, up to now, what's been his strategy? Soon as he heard that Esau was coming with 400 men, the first thing he did was he divided into two camps. Chapter 32. And he says, what? At least half of us should get away while he's destroying the other half. So he's got to choose. All right? That was his first one. Then he says, then I'm going to shore up my bet. I'm going to do something else. So he sends 5 groups of animals to kind of buy off his brother. Okay? And he tells each one of the herdsmen what to say to pacify the brother. Then that doesn't work. He's not sure. He's restless all night. And so the night before, you know what else he does? He takes the wives and the children and he has them cross the Jabbok River. Then he retreats back to the other side. So he's putting all of this in front, and he's going to hide behind all of this. The notion of self-preservation is very strong in Jacob. And he'll sacrifice everything for his own life. This man who's been driven by fear at every step, whether it was from his brother, whether it was from being born second, to not having money, to not having power, fearing his uncle. Now we see him at the critical moment. And he steps up. He steps forward. And he goes ahead of them. And he's going to face up to his fears. He's going to face up to his brother, as he never thought he could do. Why? Because he has just spent the night with God, and God has been wrestling with him, reminding him of his weakness, reminding him of all the pain that is caused, and brought him to the point where he did one final thing. It says in Hosea, he pleaded with God, bless me. And he did it with tears. Hosea 12. And in doing so, God gave him the promise that he would. And so this is what happened to him. Now, talking about brokenness. See this finger? Kind of hard to see. Kind of crooked, isn't it? Well, this happened when I was a kid on the school playground. We were playing softball. And a ball this big jammed into this finger. And when I saw it, it was bent backwards in a way that was unnatural. And so I looked at the thing, and I felt the pain, and I put it back in place. And I never told my mom about it because I didn't want to cause her any problems. And it eventually healed. But it healed funny. Okay? Now, fortunately, this is not a very functional pinky, right? But there are other parts of us, other bones, that if it's broken and it starts to heal the wrong way, the doctor's got to come in. And what does he have to do? He has to break it so that he can reset it properly. Otherwise, you can't function. And this is what God does spiritually for Jacob. He comes to this area where he's bent. And I love that term. And some Bible translations even use that term to show, something's wrong. This is something that needs to be corrected. And God takes this area of his need, of his brokenness, and he will reset it. Let me read to you from Job 5:17 and 18. It says this, "Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty." Next verse, "For he wounds, but he binds up. He shatters, but his hands heal." And so he comes, and there will be a brokenness that he's going to need to break so that he can rebind, and he can reheal, and he can make straight that which is bent in us. And he tries to do it in little ways. All through his life, God has been trying to get him to correct it. And it hasn't worked. And because it hasn't worked, he's got to come and break it. Now, Mark, you play golf. Do you ever slice the ball?
Me? Are you kidding?
Okay. Some of you go bowling. I got this hook that I can't break. Okay? And so my ball's going right where it should go, and at the last minute, because of that hook, it puts a little extra spin and it goes into the gutter just before it hits any of the pins. We got to work at it and discipline ourselves to break ourselves of these kind of things that cause us to self-sabotage. And so that's what God does. And so God comes to Jacob and he tells him to look at himself, his name, his life, they're congruent, always fighting, always wrestling, always in a rivalry, always expressing his fear. And then he ties him up. And he says, I'm not going to let you come up with any schemes. I'm not going to let you keep trying to figure out how to do it. I'm going to tie you up until the last minute. And all you can do is trust me. And so he wrestles him until the very last moment when day is breaking and the brother is arriving. And what does Jacob discover? He discovers what Abraham discovered when Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. That God will provide. Jehovah Jireh is his name. And it means God will provide. And so he provided for him. Jacob, you don't need to work it out every time. You don't need to fight and struggle and vie and do all these things. And so God comes to him and he breaks him of this symptom of his fear that has hurt him, hurt his relations, and been a problem in his life. In the New Testament, Jesus says, you are the vine, I am the vine dresser, and I'm going to come and I'm going to cut those branches that are unfruitful. Why? so that you can be fruitful and more fruitful. Okay? Paul says, you know what? I saw this wonderful vision of heaven one day, but God knows that this kind of a vision and experience can make a man proud. And so God put a thorn in my flesh to keep me humble and keep me from becoming ruined by pride. And I've seen this over and over and over again. That sometimes it's so therapeutic to have suffering, to have God come not only to cause us suffering, but even to break us if necessary, so that we can heal the right way and be useful to Him. Peter could never be the lead apostle as long as he thought he was superior, because he needed to be the servant of all and not to become arrogant. Jonah needed to be broken of his cultural pride, his ethnic pride, his nationalism. Even Moses needed to be broken, because Moses says, these people hate me. And God says, no, it's not about you, Moses, it's about me. And he didn't learn. So one day, in the midst of the people's complaining, he took a rod and he hit a rock and produced water, a mighty miracle. But God says, you didn't listen to me. And again, you thought it was about you. And so you don't get to go into the promised land. You know, God has always done this with His leaders and the people He wanted to use, including all 12 of the apostles. Let me read to you from Psalm 51, 16 and 17. It says, for you, God, will not delight in sacrifice, or I will give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. But here is what God does want. And this is where pastors have come up with the word brokenness. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. And so, the question is, what is it in us that we need God to work on some more? Where are the places where we lag behind? Where are the places where we have our little quirks, a little kind of weirdness, our little problems, our shortcomings, big or small? Because God will continue to work on these things until He makes us like Christ. It says in Psalm 139, at the last two verses, that we should seek God's leading so that we can cooperate with Him in our breaking. Verses 23 and 24 says this, Psalm 139, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there is any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This needs to be our prayer. We don't have to cover up, because God accepts us as we are. But you know, we need to cooperate with God for the change that we need until we're 97 or 197. And God will exert His pressure and His teaching. And you know, if you feel God exerting pressure, yield to Him. Don't let it become to the point where He needs to break. But ask Him, what is it you're trying to do? What issue am I needing work on? What are you trying to change in my life, oh God? And then if He comes and He does do the breaking, then don't resent God for it, because it's for our good. This suffering ultimately brings us to the place of hope. It's said in Romans 5. And unlike a bone, even when God breaks us, we need to stay broken. That's the problem with the human spirit, that we will need to continue to work on it. I just finished a great book called The Generals. And it's about Generals Marshall, Patton, and MacArthur, and how they were instrumental in winning World War II. And in it, the many stories talks about General Patton and how he loved to ride horses. And there was one time where he was sitting on a horse and he was drilling his troops. And suddenly the horse reared up and threw him, caught him by surprise. So Patton gets right back on the horse. Well, this horse wouldn't quit. So it rears up again, and this time falls on General Patton, pinning his leg. Well, General Patton finally pulls his leg out from him, and you know what? He stands. He's astride the horse. Why? So that when the horse gets up, who's on top? General Patton. As the horse got up and Patton was still on top, still saying, I'm in control. The horse did one final thing. He bucked forward with his head and hit General Patton in the head, and he started bleeding. It's just like a stuck pig. Well, General Patton just calmly finished reviewing the troops, drilling them, and the horse had to endure that General Patton wouldn't give up. You know, that's God. We have these issues, and we think we can ignore them. And we think that when they act up, when they get presented, when they become a problem in our lives, we can just let them go away, and hopefully everybody forgets. But God will stay on top of it, and He will work on it. Because true grace is not just that He takes us as we are and accepts us, but then He takes us to the levels that He wants us to go, so He can use us, and so He can bless us. And this is the blessedness of brokenness. And this is the lesson of Jacob's life. We're going to have one more sermon on it, and we're going to see how that plays out after Mother's Day. All right? Be here for Mother's Day. Invite the mothers that you know. We have some special things. The children are going to come sing, but we're also going to have a little mini concert, especially for the moms. Okay? A friend of mine who is often called the Chinese version of Neil Diamond is going to come, and he's going to sing some special songs for our moms. Anyway, all right, now we move on to the Lord's table.